Okay, welcome. We're going to talk about the different biological kingdoms today. So remember that last time we focused on both domains, or just domains actually, and that there were three types of domains: the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. We're going to focus now one level below that on the hierarchy at kingdoms. A little bit of background. This field of biology is known as taxonomy, and it's the classification, description, identification, and naming of living organisms. People who practice taxonomy are known as taxonomists. And taxonomy has changed over time a lot, and it continues to change as we make new discoveries. Aristotle and other philosophers of the time used to classify substances into either those that belong to the body, living, animal, or human. And you can see how they further kind of subdivide things. Carolus Linnaeus in the 18th century divided the natural world into two kingdoms, animals and plants. And he actually wrote a book called Systema Naturae that was the first real international taxonomic book in which he outlined his hierarchy for life and also named thousands of species using his binomial system of nomenclature. Ernst Haeckel proposed another kingdom, Protista, for unicellular organisms, and he later proposed the fourth kingdom, Monera, for unicellular organisms who lack nuclei, like bacteria. So Monera used to be the bacteria. And you can start to see how the taxonomic tree is changing over time here. Robert Whittaker, added another kingdom of life, fungi, in the 20th century. And now we have this five-kingdom tree that was considered standard for many, many years, where it was animals, plants, protists, fungi, and Monera. Before this, people used to classify fungi with either protists or plants. And it wasn't until we started to do genomic analysis that we realized that fungi were a totally separate kingdom. Carl Woese created a genetics-based tree of life based on similarities and differences observed in small subunit ribosomal RNA. Again, all living things have ribosomes. They use these to make proteins, and those ribosomes are made out of RNA. And if you compare the RNA of a ribosome from one species to another, you can see the differences. And when he did this, he discovered archaea. He noticed that these creatures that we now put in archaea were, even though they looked very similar to bacteria, genetically they were as different from bacteria as you are from a banana. So there was no way that we could continue to have these two kingdoms together. Instead, it was, or these two domains together. Instead, we made a third domain. And this is the current taxonomic scheme that we use in biology. But as you'll learn, it's still changing. So domain Eubacteria includes kingdom bacteria, and domain Archaea includes kingdom Archaea, which can be a little confusing. I mentioned this in the last set of notes, but Eubacteria and Eukarya are still very different things, even though they both start with the prefix eu. Eu just means true. So to translate that would be true bacteria, and then eukarya would be true karya, referring to nucleus. So true bacteria, true nucleus. One mistake people make is they assume that EU means nucleus, and it doesn't. Okay, so we have domain bacteria with kingdom bacteria, domain archaea with kingdom archaea, and then domain eukarya with 4 kingdoms in the eukaryotic domain: protists, plants, fungus, and animals. Now, we're not going to worry about classifying prokaryotic cells like archaea and bacteria. They are extremely diverse, but it really is beyond the scope of what IB biology is getting at. All right, so eubacteria, also known as bacteria, are all unicellular prokaryotes, meaning that they're only one cell big and they don't have a nucleus. Eubacteria can be either autotrophic or heterotrophic. And we'll get into these words again, but just real quick, autotrophic means that you are creating your own food, usually through photosynthesis, but sometimes through other means, whereas heterotrophic means you're consuming your own food. Eubacteria have important roles in ecosystems, including nutrient recycling and food production. Without bacteria, we wouldn't be able to decompose dead organisms, and those dead bodies would just pile up. We wouldn't be able to take those nutrients out of those dead bodies and recycle them into the environment. So the entire ecosystem would collapse very quickly without bacteria. Of course, we also use bacteria to make food as well, such as yogurt. Some eubacteria are pathogenic, which means they cause disease, but the majority, the vast majority of eubacteria are common and harmless. In fact, you have millions of bacteria on your skin, and those bacteria are necessary. Even though it might kind of gross you out, without them, bad bacteria could take hold. So because you're covered in bacteria, there's really no space or room for new bad bacteria to latch on and grow. We also use bacteria to help produce antibiotics, pharmaceuticals, vitamins, and yogurt. One big new realm of study is known as the human microbiome. We're finding that the vast amount of species of bacteria that are inside you and on you have so many different factors in human health. For instance, there's correlations between the microbiome, having a bad microbiome, and autism and depression. So there's still a lot that we need to learn about the microbiome, but we know that there can be up to 5,000 different species of bacteria, within your microbiome, either on your skin or the majority of them are in your intestines. And then we got some examples of different bacteria. The ones that you're probably really familiar with would be E. coli, Staphylococcus, which is responsible for staph infections, Streptococcus, which is responsible for strep infections. Archaea are also unicellular prokaryotes, so they're only one cell big and they don't have a nucleus. But the genomes of archaea are much larger and more complex than those of eubacteria. Many archaea are what we call extremophiles, preferring extreme hot or cold environments, or environments that are really salty, have extreme salinity, or other conditions that are hostile to most other forms of life on Earth. Their metabolism is adapted to these harsh environments. So if you've ever been to Yellowstone, you've seen these colored hot springs, and the colors are made by these thermophilic archaea. Thermophilic meaning lover of heat. And so they're extremely hot springs. But these bacteria are able to live within there and function. Here's sulfobos, an archaea that can oxidize sulfur and store sulfuric acid in its granules. Archaeobacteria are also found in extreme environments like hot boiling water and thermal vents under the ocean. There's no oxygen available down there, or the environment is highly acidic. So that's what we mean by extremophile. They live in extreme environments. They are not the typical type of bacteria that you would just encounter, which is why This domain bacteria is often referred to as domain eubacteria, because the true bacteria that you see, you don't see them, but that you think about, usually would fall under here. The archaea are ones that you're much less likely to encounter. Okay, now we're getting into the eukarya domain. So all of these going forward would have at least one cell with a nucleus. Protista, also known as the protists, are usually single-celled eukaryotic organisms. So usually you can't see them because they're one cell big, unless you have a microscope. There are some multicellular protists out there, like algae and kelp or seaweed. And these are colonial forms, meaning that they are colonies of individual cells. Otherwise, the protists are things like paramecium or amoeba. Sorry, that's an amoeba. Paramecium, amoeba. And they're a group of organisms that are defined not as much by commonality, but by exclusion. A protist is simply something that's not an animal or a plant or a fungus or a bacteria. So it's a hodgepodge kingdom, and therefore a lot of protists don't necessarily have a whole lot in common with each other, or are that genetically similar. We can divide protists into two types, those that are animal-like, which we call protozoa, and those that are plant-like, which we call algae. All right, under domain eukarya, our second kingdom is the plant kingdom, Plantae. You're probably quite familiar with the members of this kingdom. It contains all the plants you know, mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants. To be a plant, you have to be a multicellular eukaryote, meaning that all plants are multicellular. You'll never find a unicellular plant. All plants have a nucleus within their cell. All plants also have a cell wall that's made of cellulose. With just a few exceptions, plants are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food. They do this through photosynthesis by taking sunlight and using the energy in sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into glucose or sugar. There are some exceptions, like carnivorous plants who live in really nitrogen-poor soils. And so to get the nitrogen, they have to consume bugs or little birds, things like that. But carnivorous plants can still do photosynthesis. Without plants, life on Earth would not exist as we know it, because plants feed almost all of the heterotrophs. They are the foundation of our food web. And there's an estimated 300,000 species of plants that we know of so far. We're going to get into plants later in the week, but you can see on the right kind of an evolutionary history of plants. That flowers are the most recent, and mosses were the most ancient. All right, the fungal kingdom, or fungus. So fungi are also eukaryotic, so they have a nucleus. They have a cell wall like plants, but their cell wall is made out of a different molecule called chitin. Chitin is actually a sugar used more often by animals than plants. So this is why fungi are actually more closely related to you than to a plant. Fungi can be unicellular, one cell big, like yeast, or multicellular, mushrooms. All fungi are heterotrophs. Fungi do not photosynthesize. So fungi have to consume other organisms for their nutrition. And the way they do that is through this means of saprotrophic digestion. So a saprotroph is an organism that secretes digestive enzymes into their environment. A fungi, like this mushroom, it doesn't have a mouth. It can't actually physically consume something. So instead what it does is it secretes acid out in its environment, these enzymes that kind of digest the food around it, and then it absorbs that food through its cells. So this is a form of external digestion. Fungi are the principal decomposers in the ecological world. And our final kingdom, again under domain eukarya, so these have a nucleus, are animals, kingdom Animalia. To be an animal, you have to be a multicellular eukaryote. So you have to have a nucleus. All animals are more than one cell big. Animals do not have a cell wall either. They are heterotrophs, meaning they have to eat other organisms for energy. There are no autotrophic animals. And the animal kingdom is the largest kingdom with 1 million known species. And that's probably because we as humans are animals, and so we're a little biased towards studying animals versus protists or fungi. All right, so if I was to give you certain things like we found an organism that is heterotrophic, it's multicellular, it has a nucleus, and it doesn't have a cell wall, you should be able to figure out which kingdom I'm talking about. And in that case, it would be the animals. Right? If it's heterotrophic, multicellular, eukaryotic, doesn't have a cell wall. So if we give you those sort of characteristics, you should be able to tell us what kingdom or domain it fits under.